The Stolen Legacy. They say the best revenge is a life well lived. But sometimes, just sometimes, the best revenge is watching someone drown in the very trap they set for you. The autumn wind rattled against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cinerex Corporation's 42nd floor, sending golden leaves spiraling past like confetti at a funeral. I sat in my corner office, the one I'd earned through 12 years of blood, sweat, and more all-nighters than I could count, putting the finishing touches on what would be the company's largest merger and acquisition deal to date. The Meridian Pipeline acquisition wasn't just another transaction. It was my magnum opus. 18 months of delicate negotiations, strategic maneuvering, and relationship building that only someone with my institutional knowledge could have pulled off. The mahogany door to my office swung open without a knock. Sterling Thorne stood there, his Tom Ford suit so perfectly pressed it looked like he'd been vacuum-sealed into it. His smile was the kind that made you want to count your fingers after shaking his hand. He didn't speak at first, just let his gaze drift across my desk, lingering on the family photo I kept next to my monitor, then moving to the awards on my wall with the kind of contempt usually reserved for outdated technology. "I hear you're something of a relic around here," he said finally, his voice carrying that particular brand of Ivy League condescension that made even compliments sound like insults. "Eleanor speaks highly of your foundational work." I looked up from my screen, meeting his eyes with the practiced calm I'd perfected over years of boardroom battles. "And you are?" "Sterling Thorne, your new colleague in strategic operations." He paused, savoring the moment. "Well, more accurately, your new supervisor." The email from Eleanor Vance arrived 17 minutes later, copied to the entire C-suite and senior management team. #@Meta. Sex 0.05. Subject line: Organizational restructuring for enhanced strategic alignment. The corporate speak was thick enough to choke on, but the message was clear. I was being transitioned to a strategic advisory role, which in the lexicon of corporate assassination meant being stripped of all operational authority while maintaining just enough presence to make it look like a lateral move. Sterling would be taking over all active M&A projects, including Meridian. I read the email 3 times, my expression never changing. Around me, I could feel the office watching through the glass walls, waiting to see if I would crack. I didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I opened a new folder on my encrypted drive and labeled it simply Insurance. Then I began the methodical process of documenting everything. Every email, every meeting note, every draft, every timestamp. The printer in my office hummed to life, its quiet mechanical breathing the only sound as page after page of evidence accumulated in my locked filing cabinet. Over the next week, the isolation campaign began with surgical precision. My calendar, once packed with strategy sessions and leadership meetings, became a wasteland of white space. The 2 senior analysts I'd mentored from their first days at Cinerex were suddenly reassigned to Sterling's team. They came to my office separately, eyes downcast, mumbling about career opportunities and nothing personal. I told them I understood, and I meant it. In this ecosystem, survival often meant swimming with the sharks, not against them. The real knife came during the quarterly all-hands meeting. Sterling stood at the podium in the main conference room, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind him like a constellation of broken promises. He was presenting my Meridian strategy, my 18 months of work, with only the fonts changed and a few charts recolored. "We're building on some decent foundational work," he said, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. but it needed significant modernization to meet today's market demands. The room erupted in polite applause. Eleanor sat in the front row, her expression one of practiced neutrality. But I caught the slight upturn of her lips when Sterling used the word modernization. She'd orchestrated this beautifully, bringing in her golden boy to claim my crown while I was still wearing it. That evening, I stayed late, waiting until the office emptied and the cleaning crew had finished their rounds. In the silence of the deserted floor, I unlocked my fireproof filing cabinet and pulled out the originals. Contracts with my handwritten notes in the margins. Negotiation transcripts where my voice shaped every crucial term. Emails dating back 3 years showing the evolution of the Meridian strategy from concept to execution. I photocopied everything, creating 3 complete sets. One stayed in the cabinet, one went home with me, and the third would wait for the right moment. Richard Miller was old-school Wall Street, stack, meta, the kind of board member who still believed in honor among thieves. We'd worked together on the Henderson acquisition 5 years ago, and he'd seen firsthand how I could turn a dying deal into gold. I sent him an anonymous email from a burner account, just 3 sentences. The continuity clause in the Meridian structure has been modified. Original architect unaware of changes. Pipeline ownership protocols from previous iteration may be relevant. I knew Rick would understand the subtext. In our world, continuity clauses were like fingerprints, unique to their creators. The next Monday's leadership meeting was Sterling's coronation. He strutted in reeking of cologne that probably cost more than most people's rent, laying out his acquisition timeline with the confidence of someone who'd never had to earn anything. "I'll be presenting this to the buyers committee on Friday," he announced, shooting me a glance that was equal parts triumph and dismissal. "Eleanor will be providing support, given her extensive work on the foundational elements." Eleanor nodded graciously. "Nadia has been invaluable in establishing the groundwork," she said, her tone suggesting I'd done little more than arrange the office supplies. "Sterling's fresh perspective is exactly what this deal needs to close successfully." I sat through the meeting taking notes in a leather journal that appeared blank to anyone watching. In reality, I was documenting every word, every gesture, every piece of evidence that Sterling and Eleanor were presenting my work as their own. The journal would later be photographed, page by page, and uploaded to my encrypted cloud storage with timestamps that would hold up in court. That afternoon, I received a forwarded email from Rick. No message, just an attachment, labeled TXN Clause V3 Draft Tank. Inside was a PDF of the continuity clause I'd written 2 years ago, word for word as I'd crafted it, including a peculiarity I'd intentionally embedded. "Operational transition shall proceed according to established continuity protocols, except in cases of disputed authority." Rick had highlighted the next sentence, one that Sterling clearly hadn't noticed. "In such instances, operational continuity shall vest with the most senior operational leader, effective immediately upon recognized dispute." The acquisition closing was scheduled for Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock in Conference Room A, the one with the glass walls that looked out over the Hudson River. I arrived 15 minutes early, taking my usual seat halfway down the table, close enough to hear everything, but far enough to avoid the spotlight. My briefcase contained a single manila envelope, slim enough that no one noticed it. Sterling commanded the head of the table like a general surveying his battlefield, flanked by Eleanor and 2 junior associates who scurried around him like pilot fish. The buyer's delegation filed in precisely at 3, led by Ava Chen, their chief legal counsel. Ava was a legend in M&A circles, known for finding the single thread that could unravel an entire deal. Her reputation for thoroughness was matched only by her intolerance for bullshit. "Shall we begin?" Sterling said, his voice dripping with premature victory. "I believe we're all aligned on the major points. The transition should be seamless. My team controls all operational aspects." For 40 minutes, Sterling walked through the presentation, my work dressed up in his PowerPoint templates. He fielded questions with the kind of surface-level understanding that comes from memorizing someone else's thoughts without comprehending their foundation. When Ava asked about the risk mitigation strategies for regulatory challenges, he gave an answer so generic it could have come from a first-year MBA textbook. I watched Ava's eyes narrow slightly, a tell I recognized from our previous dealings. "I have a question about Section 7, Ava said, her voice cutting through Sterling's self-congratulation. "The continuity clause. I'd like clarity on the language." Sterling waved his hand dismissively, not even bothering to flip to the relevant page. "Standard boilerplate. It doesn't affect buyers' rights. All authority transfers through my office as the lead on this acquisition." That's when I moved. Not dramatically, just a slight shift forward as I pulled the manila envelope from my briefcase and extracted a single black business card. The card was austere, almost aggressive in its simplicity. White text on matte black stock that seemed to absorb light. "Nadia Hayes, Executive Advisor, Operational Continuity." I slid it across the table to Ava with deliberate precision. Ava picked up the card, studying it with the intensity of an archaeologist examining a potentially game-changing artifact. She looked at Rick Miller, who had been silent throughout the meeting. Rick's expression didn't change, but something passed between them, the kind of nonverbal communication that comes from decades of reading the same playbook. "Actually," Rick said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in corporate warfare, "Mr. Thorne, are you familiar with the operational history of this acquisition?" Sterling's confidence flickered for the first time. "I've been fully briefed on all aspects of this deal." "Have you?" Ava opened her leather portfolio and withdrew a document I recognized immediately. It was the original continuity clause draft, complete with metadata showing creation date and author. "Because this continuity clause, the one that forms the backbone of your transition strategy, has some interesting characteristics. The language is quite specific, unique even." She began reading aloud, each word falling like a hammer blow. "Operational transition shall proceed according to established continuity protocols, except in cases of disputed authority. In such instances, Sex 0.05, operational continuity shall vest with the most senior operational leader, effective immediately upon recognized dispute." Sterling's face drained of color as he frantically flipped through his copy of the documents. This wasn't in the final draft I reviewed." "It's in the signed version," Ava replied coolly. "The version that was executed 6 months ago when the preliminary agreements were put in place. The version created by—" She glanced at her notes, though I knew she didn't need to. "Nadia Hayes." The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. Eleanor's composed mask finally cracked, her lips pressed into a thin line as she realized the trap they'd walked into. "I don't understand," Sterling stammered, looking between Eleanor and Ava like a drowning man searching for a life preserver. "Eleanor, you said the documentation was clean, that we had full authority." Eleanor stood slowly, her movements controlled but tension visible in every line of her body. There seems to be some confusion about the documentation. Perhaps we should take a brief recess to review. Actually, Rick interrupted, his tone suggesting the discussion was already over. I think we're perfectly clear on the situation. The continuity clause explicitly states that in cases of disputed authority, operational control vests with the most senior operational leader. He turned to me. Ms. Hayes, I believe you've been with Cinerex for 12 years? 12 years, 3 months, I confirmed, my voice steady and clear. And Mr. Thorne, you've been with us for... Sterling's jaw clenched. 6 weeks. Ava closed her portfolio with a decisive snap. Then, according to the terms of the signed agreement, operational authority for this transition rests with Ms. Hayes, effective immediately. She looked at Sterling with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so clinical. I assume you'll want to brief her on any changes you've made to her original strategy. What happened next was beautiful in its simplicity. Sterling turned to Eleanor, his expression a mixture of rage and desperation. You brought me in for this. You said it was mine to lead. You promised. Eleanor's response was a masterclass in corporate disavowal. She simply walked around the table, picked up Sterling's company tablet from in front of him, and nodded toward the door. Not a word of explanation, not a moment of acknowledgement. Sterling Thorne had just become a non-person in the Cinerex universe. He stood on unsteady legs, his perfect suit suddenly looking like a costume that didn't quite fit. He looked around the room for support, for anyone who would meet his eyes, but found only averted gazes and sudden interest in smartphones. Finally, his gaze landed on me. I met his stare with the detached interest of someone looking at a spreadsheet that no longer required their attention. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. The best victories don't require celebration. They simply require witnessing. Sterling walked out of conference room A with the mechanical movements of someone in shock, the glass door closing behind him with a soft whisper that might as well have been a thunderclap. Through the transparent walls, we could see him standing by the elevator bank, his shoulders slumped, pressing the button repeatedly as if that would make it arrive faster. Now then, Ava said, turning back to me with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. Miss Hayes, shall we discuss the actual transition plan? I believe you had some innovative approaches to the regulatory challenges that weren't fully captured in Mr. Thorne's interpretation. I pulled out the comprehensive binder I'd prepared 3 weeks ago, the one Sterling never knew existed, containing not just the original strategy, but several contingency plans I'd developed during my late-night sessions. I believe you'll find everything in order, I said, sliding it across to her, including solutions to the 3 regulatory hurdles Mr. Thorne seemed unaware of. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, but it was a different creature entirely. We discussed real challenges, actual solutions, the kind of detailed strategic planning that only comes from deep understanding. Eleanor sat silent throughout, her authority effectively neutralized. She couldn't leave without admitting defeat, but every minute she stayed was a reminder of her failed coup. As the meeting concluded and hands were shaken, Rick lingered behind. He waited until the others had filed out before approaching me. That continuity clause, he said quietly. That wasn't an accident, was it? In my experience, I replied, packing up my materials with practiced efficiency, the best insurance policies are the ones you hope you'll never need to use. He nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. Your work on Meridian has been exceptional, Nadia. It would have been a shame to see it attributed to someone else. After he left, I sat alone in the conference room as the sun began its descent toward the Jersey skyline, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Through the glass walls, I could see the normal rhythm of office life continuing. The other employees went about their business, most unaware of the palace coup that had just been reversed. But I noticed the subtle changes. The way the junior analysts who'd been reassigned to Sterling's team were already gathering their belongings from his office. The way Eleanor's assistant was frantically making phone calls, presumably for damage control. Meta, the way my own phone had begun lighting up with meeting requests that had been mysteriously absent for the past 2 weeks. I thought about Sterling, probably still in the elevator or maybe already in the lobby, trying to process how his guaranteed victory had turned to ash in his mouth. I thought about Eleanor, who would have to explain to the board how her hand-picked superstar had flamed out in less than 2 months. But mostly, I thought about the document in my briefcase, the one I hadn't needed to use. A formal complaint to the SEC about intellectual property theft in a major acquisition, complete with documentation that would have triggered an investigation into both Sterling and Eleanor. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at the little jazz club in Greenwich Village that had become my sanctuary during the tough years. The bartender, an old soul named Tommy who'd been pouring drinks there since the 70s, raised an eyebrow when I ordered champagne instead of my usual whiskey neat. "Celebrating?" he asked. "Surviving," I corrected, though the distinction seemed less important than it once had. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find a small crowd gathered outside my door. The analysts who'd been reassigned to Sterling were there, along with several other team members who'd been mysteriously unavailable during my isolation. They looked sheepish, uncertain, waiting for some sign of how I would handle their fair-weather loyalty. I unlocked my door, turned to face them, and said simply, "We have a deal to close. I'll need status reports from each of you by noon." They scattered with visible relief, eager to prove their renewed dedication. I knew half of them would probably betray me again if the winds shifted, but that was the nature of corporate life. You didn't survive by holding grudges. You survived by being better prepared than your enemies. Eleanor lasted another 3 months. The official story was that she was pursuing other opportunities, the kind of vague corporate speak that meant she'd been given the choice between resigning and being fired. Her departure was announced in a brief email on a Friday afternoon, timed to minimize attention. I didn't see her leave, but I heard she cleared out her office after hours, taking the service elevator to avoid running into anyone. Sterling's LinkedIn profile showed him at a boutique consulting firm within a month, the kind of place where fallen corporate stars went to rehabilitate their reputations. His bio mentioned extensive M&A experience at a Fortune 500 company, carefully omitting both Cinerex's name and the brevity of his tenure. The Meridian acquisition closed successfully, exceeding projected returns by 30% in the first quarter. The board noted this in my performance review, along with what they called my exceptional handling of transitional challenges, corporate speak for surviving an assassination attempt. 6 months later, I was promoted to Executive Vice President of Strategic Operations, the position Eleanor had once held. The announcement email, sent to the entire company, noted my 12 years of dedicated service and proven leadership in complex acquisitions. No mention was made of the 6 weeks when my legacy had been stolen and then reclaimed. I had the office redecorated, not dramatically, just enough to make it mine. The same family photo sat on my desk, the same awards hung on the walls, but I added one new item. A small framed quote that sat where only I could see it. It read, "The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when you've had the foresight to document it." The corporate world is an ecosystem of predators and prey, of alliances and betrayals, of stolen credit and reclaimed victories. I'd learned long ago that you couldn't avoid the game, but you could play it better than those who thought you were just another relic to be pushed aside. Sterling and Eleanor had thought me weak because I didn't roar, didn't make threats, didn't engage in their theatrical power plays. They'd mistaken patience for passivity, preparation for paralysis. Now, sitting in my corner office with its view of the Hudson, I pulled up the encrypted folder on my computer, the one labeled Insurance. Inside were still dozens of documents I'd never needed to use, evidence of other small betrayals, other attempted thefts of credit. I selected them all and hovered my finger over the delete key. After a moment's consideration, I moved them to a different folder instead, one labeled Lessons Learned. Because in this world, the best revenge isn't just survival. It's being ready for the next Sterling Thorne who walks through your door without knocking, thinking you're just another relic to be swept aside. It's knowing that while they're playing checkers, you're already 3 moves ahead in chess. It's the quiet satisfaction of watching them drown in their own arrogance, while you simply continue doing what you've always done. The work. With excellence. With patience. And with the foresight to protect what's yours. The sun was setting again over Manhattan, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and amber as on the day Sterling had first darkened my doorway. But this time, I wasn't watching someone else claim my work. This time, I was planning the next acquisition, the next strategic move, the next victory that would bear my name from conception to completion. They say the best revenge is a life well lived. But sometimes, the best revenge is simply being better at the game than those who thought they could play you. And as I looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just better at the game. I had written the rules they were still trying to understand. The phone rang, Rick Miller's name appearing on the display. "Nadia," he said when I answered. "The board's been discussing the Singapore expansion. We need someone who understands complex negotiations and won't get played by the competition. Interested?" I smiled, already pulling up the preliminary research I'd started weeks ago, anticipating this call. "When do we start?" "Monday morning, 8 sharp. And Nadia?" He paused. "This time, make sure any continuity clauses are even more airtight. We wouldn't want another misunderstanding." "Don't worry," I assured him, looking at the black business card I kept in my desk drawer, a reminder of the day I took back what was mine. I've learned that the best contracts are the ones where you controlled both the text and the subtext. As I hung up and began preparing for Monday's meeting, I thought about Sterling one more time. Not with anger or resentment, but with something approaching gratitude. He'd taught me a valuable lesson, that sometimes the greatest threats come not from your known enemies, but from those who smile while stealing your crown. And he'd taught me something even more important, that when someone tries to bury you, they'd better make sure you're actually dead. Because if you're not, if you're just lying there gathering strength and documenting everything, they'll learn what I learned long ago in this concrete jungle of Manhattan. Survival isn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. It's about being the one still standing when the dust settles, holding all the cards that matter, ready to play them when the moment is right. The office was quiet now, most of the staff gone home to their lives outside these walls. But I remained, as I often did, not because I had to, but because I chose to. This was my domain, earned through years of excellence, temporarily stolen but ultimately reclaimed. And as the city lights sparkled like diamonds against the darkening sky, I knew that whatever battles lay ahead, I was ready. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all. In the corporate world, they can try to steal your work, your credit, your position. But they can't steal your knowledge, your relationships, or your ability to plan 3 steps ahead. And when you combine those with patience, documentation, and the wisdom to embed safeguards in everything you create, you become something more than just another executive trying to climb the ladder. You become the one who writes the rules that others don't even know they're playing by.